Hi everyone, welcome to this video training series which will give you an introduction to Microkeeper. I hope you will leave this series with a deeper knowledge of our software and the confidence to start using it. My name is Rhiannon and I'm an account manager here at Microkeeper in the customer support team. So let's get underway. Today we're looking at the first step for many Microkeeper users, our global settings and adding employees to the platform. You'll learn the basics of our global system settings, how to manually add an employee to Microkeeper, how to bulk upload an employee to Microkeeper, and how to update an employee's individual Microkeeper profile. So the first thing that you should do after registering an account with Microkeeper is customize your global settings. These settings determine how many of Microkeeper's various components function. At the top of the page, you'll see the ATO software ID. You'll need this number in order to link your Microkeeper account with the ATO system. This is important for single-touch payroll. The first section is business contact information. Not all fields are required, such as website and mobile number, but we recommend you fill in as much information as you can. This information is sent to the tax office when single-touch payroll is submitted. System settings affect all areas of Microkeeper. For more information on each setting, hover your mouse over the information icon. Roster settings affect the administrative side of setting a roster and how your employees can see their roster. Do you require your staff to confirm their roster? Do you want managers to be sent an email if an employee doesn't clock on to a rostered shift? Do you want estimated wage costs displayed on the roster? Do you want employees to receive their roster via SMS? And if you do you want the note on the roster to be sent in the SMS as well? How much of the roster do you want your employees to see? For example, do you want them to only be able to see their individual roster? Or should they be able to see their entire department's roster? Or you can allow them to see the whole business's roster. Do you want to be able to edit locked rosters? Or do you want to be able to edit rosters from previous weeks? And lastly, do you want your managers who do the roster to be able to lock the roster? Or do you want to only allocate admin staff to be able to do this? Timesheet settings will affect the time in attendance data. Would you like the clock on and clock off times of employees to be rounded to a particular nearest value? If you want to know the exact time when an employee clocked on to the minute, have this value set to 1. Would you like the timesheets to be rounded up if an employee clocks on before their rostered start time? Please note, a roster needs to be set for this feature to work. If you want to restrict an employee's ability to clock their hours to a GPS location, use this field to set the radius. This is useful if you have a large location and you need a larger radius. If you only have a small location, 70 meters is probably ideal. Do you want to restrict employees clocking to a particular IP address? Make sure that you select your time zone. And if you have staff that work past midnight, make sure you have shift work turned on. If they don't work past midnight, we recommend having normal turned on. This means that Microkeeper will assume that an employee has forgotten to clock off. If they are still clocked on at midnight, the system will automatically clock them off. How would you like approval to be done? Do you want to approve each individual shift in the timesheet area? Or is visual approval fine? Visual approval is recommended if you just have one manager or one administrative staff approving the timesheets. If you have many staff approving timesheets, we recommend having tick approval turned on. If you wish for a timesheet to be automatically approved if it matches the roster, meaning a staff member worked exactly what they were expected to, have automatically approved shifts that match roster turned on. The last setting is if you wish managers to get an email if they have shifts pending approval. Payroll settings are important to set before you do payroll for the first time. Select your pay period. Payment days in arrears is the amount of days after your pay period ends that you process payroll. The super rate will default to 9.5%, and the default super minimum will default to $450. Jobs to payslip is important to have set if you track costs to different cost codes. You only need to have address in window option selected if you intend to print out payslips and mail them via the post. Access to profile settings. If you want your staff to be able to edit their own availability, have availability editable switched on. Otherwise, staff will need to ask their manager to change their availability for them in Microkeeper. And lastly, entitlement settings. This is the global setting for your staff members' entitlements for leave. If you have an individual staff member who has a different leave entitlement, you can change that for them in their individual employee profile. Each new staff member that you add to Microkeeper will have these default leave settings. That is all for the global settings. We'll now move on to how to add an employee to Microkeeper. This is the employees section of Microkeeper. Here is where you can add new employees and edit your employees' details. To manually add a new employee, click the Add New Employee button at the top of the page. Enter their first name, last name, and the system will automatically assign them a username. If you get a red icon, it means the username is not unique. If you have the new employee's email and or mobile number, enter them here, but it's not required. It will be required to enter an email or mobile number if you want to send them their username and password straight away, but you can do that later if you need to. Use the clone from feature if you know that their profile needs to be set up in a similar way to another existing employee. And finally, click the Add Employee button. Going back to the employees list, you can now see your new employee in the list. Next, we'll move on to how to import employees in bulk. To import employees in bulk, click the Import Employees button at the top of the page. There's two ways you can import employees in bulk. If you use Xero as an accounting software and your employees are up to date, you can connect to Xero and import your employee data that way. Alternatively, you can import your employees via a CSV file. Once you have finished all the steps importing your CSV file, the employees will now be in your employee list. You should now click Edit next to their names to review their individual employee profile. Now it's time to review an employee's individual profile. Click Edit next to their name. Any changes made to this page are automatically saved, and you can see that in the save log on the right of the screen. First step will be to update their personal details, including their first name, last name. Employee ID is from a third-party system if they have an employee ID. from that system. Enter their most up-to-date address. The employee can update this themselves once they get their username and password to log into their own Microkeeper account. If you've already set up groups in Microkeeper, this is where you can allocate this employee to those groups. Payment and employment details are very important. Set their rate and the amount of hours that they do weekly. If you have a fortnightly payroll system, you still should put the weekly hours in this field. The salary calculator will estimate their annual salary. If an employee is going to be paid according to their timesheet, have the timesheet field selected. If they are paid via a salary, which means they get paid the set amount of hours and the set rate each week, have salary selected. Auto overtime means that any hours in their timesheet over the hours set here in their hours field will be put into overtime. For example, if they work 40 hours, 2 of those hours will be in overtime at 1.5 multiplier. Auto till means that any hours in their timesheet over 38 will be put into a time in lieu balance. So for example, if they work 40 hours, 2 hours would be put into till, and the employee will only be paid 38 hours that week. The static roster option is important for leave and public holiday. If an employee always works the same amount of hours on the same days, have static roster selected. But if an employee's roster always varies, as in they work different days and different hours, have varying roster selected. If you have jobs set up in the system, here is where you can assign the employee's default job. The entitlements section is where you can set the employee's leave entitlements. In general, the default will be 4 weeks annual leave and 2 weeks personal leave and 1 out of 60 weeks for long service leave. If you want an employee to accrue their annual leave on their varying hours in their timesheet, have this selected, vary by hours worked. But if you wish this employee to accrue a fixed number of entitlement leave hours each week or each pay run, have fixed basic hours set. This will accrue their leave entitlements on the hours you have set here. Fill out the employee tax information. An employee can fill this out themselves if they log into their Microkeeper account. Super details. If an employee gets super on overtime, have on total hours selected. But if super can only be accrued on their normal hours, have on basic hours selected. If they have an additional super rate, which is on top of the super guarantee, enter that here. Or if you want to override that amount, as in have a fixed amount that overrides the 9.5% guarantee, enter that here. And if their super minimum differs from $450, change this amount. You will need to put a super fund into this section if you want to pay their super via Microkeeper. An employee can also fill this out for themselves when they log into Microkeeper. If you're not paying super with Microkeeper, it's not necessary to fill in this section. Previously accumulated is for figures from a previous system. If you had this employee in another system such as Xero or MYOB, and they have pre-accumulated leave balances and earnings, you can enter those figures here so that now moving on with Microkeeper, they accrue on top of those figures. Here is where you can adjust what the employee sees on their payslip, and also if they want to be able to print out a payslip for themselves. You may also choose to hide their end time on the roster. This is important if you don't know exactly when you want the employee to finish work. You could hide the end time so they just see a start time on their roster. You can also choose to hide an employee's timesheet from their employee console. This means that they won't be able to review their own timesheet and they would need to request a manager to provide them with their timesheet. The active status section is where we can terminate an employee. To terminate an employee, you would select this option here. If this option is selected, they will no longer appear in your employee list. If you've accidentally added an employee to your list and you want to delete them, this is the option you would also use. Access control is how you give your employees different levels of permissions. This affects what they can do with Microkeeper. For every employee, you should review how they can do their input. For every employee, if you're using timesheets, you'll want to review how they can clock their hours. If you don't need them to clock their hours, you could keep this set to NFC, fingerprint facial. That means that unless you've got a fingerprint scanner or an iPad set up for facial recognition, they won't be able to clock their hours. If you have an NFC fingerprint scanner or an iPad set up for facial recognition, have this option selected. PC restricted means that we've set up Microkeeper to restrict clocking via an IP address. GPS location restricted means that an employee can only clock in within a GPS radius. GPS any location means that an employee's location is recorded when they clock on and when they clock off, but it doesn't restrict where they can clock on and clock off from. They can clock on and off from anywhere. Any internet device means that an employee can clock on from anywhere and from any type of device. It won't record their location. Self-managed means that an employee can enter their own timesheet at any point in time. For example, at the end of the week, they can use Microkeeper to enter in their full week's worth of timesheets. Manager options is what you'll give your managers. You'll want to allow them access to rosters if they set rosters. Be careful to allow them to see costs on the roster if you don't want them to be able to calculate the wages of each employee. Have the display costs options selected if you want them to see wage cost estimation. If you want a manager to be able to approve timesheets, you'll need full access switched on. Read only will only allow them to see the timesheets, but it won't allow them to approve timesheets. Timesheet no access means that they won't be able to see any timesheets. Have leave requests selected if you need that manager to review and approve leave requests for their certain employees. And have add employee selected if you need a manager to be able to add employees to Microkeeper. If you have a fingerprint scanner or an iPad set up for facial recognition or an NFC tags device, you will need to have this selected if you want this manager to be able to register their fingerprints or facial recognition or NFC tag. Payroll and admin settings should be restricted to only those staff members who can see wage details. If this staff member needs to be able to process payroll, have full access switched on. If you only want this person to be able to review payroll, have read-only switched on. If you don't want them to have any access to the payroll information, have no access switched on. For the other options, you can always hover your mouse over the blue icon for more information. You can enter in the employee's banking details here. If they choose to split their wages into separate bank accounts, you can do that here. Lastly, you can set an employee's availability or amend their availability here. Having availability hours in this section does not restrict an employee from being rostered onto a shift outside their available hours, and it doesn't restrict an employee from clocking on to a shift outside their availability hours. This section just helps your managers roster your staff better. And that's all on how to review an employee's profile. And that's it. If you have any further questions, we're here to help. You can contact us over the phone via 1-800-940-838 or email us at support@microkeeper.com.au. Thanks so much for checking in, and we'll see you next time.